Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for spending part of your rainy Wednesday afternoon with us. We have a really exciting group of women today to talk about what happened during the 2021 legislative session in energy and environment. My name is Shauna Beland. I work at the Rhode Island Office of Energy Resources, and I'm the Rhode Island Chapter Chair for NEWIEE. Today we have Sue AnderBois from the Nature Conservancy and Priscilla de la Cruz from the Audubon Society of Rhode Island. Before we launch into today's programming, I just wanted to give a big shout out to all of NEWIE's annual event sponsors. Without these organizations, we wouldn't be able to offer programming like the Rhode Island chapter events and some of NEWIE's signature events. So we always try to highlight the key sponsors for events like today. Just a really exciting upcoming event. I know I'm pretty excited about this. Jackie Birdsall from Toyota Motor North America will be presenting at the next Ask Me Anything next week. Ask Me Anything is a really exciting and dynamic speaker series that NEWIEE offers. If you haven't had the chance to attend one, I'd highly recommend this one. NEWIEE tries to highlight both energy and environmental speakers at the Ask Me Anything series, and Jackie will be our first presenter from the EV world. So we're really excited about her and being able to ask her tons of questions. And here's another upcoming event. The main chapter of NEWIEE is recently re-emerging or restarting. And so they have a chapter event coming up at the end of the month. All right, that is the end of our intro slides. But before we launch into the slides that Priscilla and Sue will present, I'll just go over their bios real quick. And before I do that, I will also give everybody a heads up that we are going to be hosting a holiday party at the Rhode Island chapter sometime, obviously in December. We're working on a location, and I will be sending an email out to the Rhode Island chapter email list with details about that once it's known. But if anybody is not on the Rhode Island chapter email list, please send your contact information to me in the chat, or feel free to email me. I'll put my email in the chat as well, and I can get you added to that list so you can come to the holiday party. Hopefully it'll be in person. So I'm going to kick us off now with the bios for Priscilla and Sue. So Priscilla is a lifelong Providence resident and has recently taken on a new role at the Audubon Society in Rhode Island as the Senior Director of Government Affairs. Before joining Audubon, Priscilla was the Rhode Island Director of the Green Energy Consumers Alliance. In June of 2019, she was elected President of the Environmental Council of Rhode Island, which is also known as ECRI. Under her direction, the council launched the Climate Crisis Campaign, which played a key role in advocating for the successful passage of the 2021 Act on Climate legislation. Working with the council's executive committee, Priscilla is also leading an equity-based strategic planning process. She recently became the co-chair of the Climate Jobs Rhode Island Initiative, a partnership among labor and environmental groups working towards a just transition to a green economy. Priscilla earned her Master of Liberal Arts with a concentration in management and sustainability and innovation from the Harvard University Extension School. She also earned a Bachelor's of Science in Business Marketing from Rhode Island College. So Sue is the Climate and Energy Program Manager at the Nature Conservancy in Rhode Island. In this role, she's focused on advocating for science-based policies to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, as well as implementing resilience planning efforts in municipalities across the state. Prior to this, Sue served as Rhode Island's first Director of Food Strategy. In this role, Sue worked with colleagues across state government and throughout Rhode Island to develop and implement Rhode, Rhode Island's food strategy. Sue has a background in policy and strategy, both in food systems and in clean energy. She's previously worked at the Energy Foundation and the Northeast Clean Energy Council. A committed community member, Sue is currently running for Providence City Council to represent Ward 3. I wish I lived in Providence so I could vote for you, Sue. She also serves as the chair of the Providence Sustainability Commission and also on the boards of the Green Energy Consumers Alliance, Southside Community Energy, or Southside Community Land Trust, and the Local Return. She has an MBA from the Yale School of Management and a BA in Environmental Studies from Dartmouth, and lives in Providence with her husband, Scott, their dog, Captain Ruggles, and 2 cats, Wasabi and Zenny. So that was a great intro to both Priscilla and Sue. And so we'll get started with your slides. Can you guys bring those up? All right, I'm going to turn this over to Priscilla now, and I'm really excited about this. Can't wait. Feel free to, if they're talking, to throw some comments or questions in the chat. After Priscilla and Sue presents, I'll ask, I've got a question to get us started, and then we'll have some audience questions for the remainder of our hour together. So that, Priscilla, go ahead.
Thanks, Shauna, and thanks to NEWIEE for inviting me to co-present with the amazing Sue AnderBois. I share your same feeling, Shauna. If I was in Sue's ward, I would be voting for her. But there are many other ways that we can support Sue in her campaign as a candidate for Providence City Council. So next we'll go ahead and segue into our agenda. Thanks for those introductions, Shauna. So we'll just get right into what we'll be covering today. So Sue and I will be co-presenting on a number of topics. We thought it would be good to first start with talking about climate crisis news. Then we'll get into what led to the momentum behind passing the 2021 Act on Climate, and we'll cover coalition work behind that. We'll do a deeper dive in terms of legislative priorities that were adopted for the previous session. In 2021, we'll cover priorities coming from the Environment Council of Rhode Island, and then get into priorities from the respective organizations that Sue and I represent. We will talk about the implementation of the Act on Climate. Sue will cover that, and Sue will also walk us through solar siting and the protection of resilient forests. We'll talk about other policies that are in progress, and also just have a discussion around what's coming next in 2022 and beyond. And as Shauna mentioned, we'll have some time for Q&A. All right, so getting into climate news. So not to start us down with any sort of downer, but just to really set it into perspective, the climate crisis and really the driver of our collective advocacy work on climate, energy, and environment. So what we've known based on science and the visible impacts of a warming climate is that the climate crisis is here, and it has been here. And the most recent IPCC report is telling us yet again that that is the case, but it's getting worse. Climate change is happening more rapidly, and it's intensifying. So we're experiencing widespread impacts in the ocean state, of course, across the nation and the globe, as well as we're seeing more intense storms, flooding, extreme heat, and warming oceans. And what the latest IPCC report is also reminding us and reminding policymakers that we truly need large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions to limit climate change. And these reductions need to happen fast, and they need to be sustained to avoid scary scenarios. So how do we not get to 1.5 degrees Celsius and avoid the scarier scenarios that would happen at 2 degrees or even higher degrees of warming? But there can be optimism, and at least I like to focus on the optimism. We know we can transition away from fossil fuels, from a fossil fuel-based economy. And right here in the ocean state, we can invest in climate. We can tap into the opportunities. There is big economic opportunity in facing this crisis and investing in a sustainable and resilient economy. So the time is really now for strong, swift climate action, and that is action across the board to really limit the impacts of climate change and also adapt our vulnerable ocean state to the changes that are irreversible when we think about sea level rise, and really working across sectors, that is private and public, to ensure that our state and our economy and our communities really remain resilient in this changing climate. Thanks, Sue. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to call this the storytelling part of my presentation. So really recapping what happened during the 2021 legislative session and what led to the passage of the Act on Climate. So where was the ocean state in facing the climate crisis prior to April of this year? So in the spring of 2021, as you've heard, the collective effort among the sponsors of the landmark 2021 Act on Climate and the leadership in the General Assembly, policymakers, and advocates, we were successful. Great. So what it took to pass the Act on Climate, what did it take to actually set the state on this required path to a net zero carbon emission economy, and that is getting to net zero emission reductions by 2050. And what was part of this landmark legislation was setting interim reduction targets of 45% by 2030 and 80% by 2040. And these targets were passed in a way that they're binding and enforceable under the Act and hold the state accountable. And that's in contrast to the Resilient Rhode Island Act of 2014. However, prior to the passage of the 2021 Act on Climate, not a significant climate and environmental bill, not one, had passed in 7 years, even with several consecutive iterations of the Act on Climate being introduced and a growing climate crisis. So the environmental community came together, it typically does, of course, every year, to form legislative priorities, and that is under the Environment Council of Rhode Island. That serves as the umbrella organization for about 60 nonprofits and individuals, and represents well over 56,000 Rhode Islanders in the state. But what was unique in late 2019, when we came together in preparation for the 2020, that 2020 legislative session prior to this one, where we recently passed the Act on Climate, was that we knew we needed to do something different. We needed to try to figure out how to present a unified voice on the Act on Climate, and for that very specific call to action. So the council launched the Climate Crisis Campaign, aiming to mobilize Rhode Islanders as well as partners that are working on intersecting issues, whether it is education, housing, transportation, you name it, public health, and really for the goal of how do we call upon the state to take immediate action to reduce emissions by phasing out fossil fuels, and how do we create a just and equitable transition to a sustainable economy, and calling also on the government to invest in climate adaptation and resiliency to protect the places that we love. Next slide, please. And part of the storytelling is the momentum, the continue and sustain momentum that it took not only from the environmental community, but also working with our friends in the labor movement to really call for this unified action around the Act on Climate. So Climate Jobs Rhode Island formed by late 2020. And the Climate Jobs Rhode Island is a partnership, a growing partnership, I should say, among labor and environmental groups, working together to establish a just transition to a green economy, and working together to figure out how do we maximize the areas that we agree on to really position Rhode Island as a leader in this transition while centering economic, environmental, racial, and social justice. So members of Climate Jobs, including the leadership of AFL-CIO, worked with the environmental community and legislative leaders to advocate for the passage of the Act on Climate. And that was different going into 2021. This recent legislative session, and calling for one of the requirements of the Act on Climate, which successfully passed, includes this robust stakeholder process that centers the voices of frontline and environmental justice communities, often Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color, and low-income communities who are disproportionately impacted by pollution, as well as frontline workers. Next slide, please. So we wanted to give you an overview on what the 2021 legislative priorities were to really set the tone for where we're going to resume our efforts as we prepare for 2022 and beyond. So to put into context, every year the Environment Council Rhode Island, or ECRI, sets a comprehensive legislative agenda from waste, water, conservation to energy issues. Till the Act on Climate passed in April of this year, ECRI had only set one top priority, and that's from the numerous important bills that are on our full legislative agenda. And we actually did the same going back to 2020. So mid-legislative session in 2021, we actually quickly came together to set our remaining priorities for the 2021 legislative session. And here I just wanted to take a moment to quickly shout out my colleagues, Kai Salem and Mel Scormron at Green Energy Consumers, who are with my previous organization, who are also part of ECRI's leadership team, because they really helped us to get organized and to execute this process in what I like to refer to an unusual legislative agenda for all of us, and figuring out how do we set our remaining priorities mid-legislative session, and also how do we refocus the continued effort and joint call to action under the climate crisis campaign. So the other priorities that were added included 100% renewable electricity by 2030, which would update our renewable energy standard. And that bill only passed the Senate. Then the other priority is the protection of our energy efficiency programs, which extended our bill-saving ratepayer funded energy efficiency programs and avoided their expiration in 2023. So this bill also successfully passed by the end of session. And then the additional bills that were part of the top priority list included the regulation of PFAS, toxic chemicals, also known as forever chemicals, that cause harm to our ecosystems and to humans. So these chemicals are found everywhere in our water and food packaging, and come from many products like grease-resistant paper, pizza boxes, water-resistant clothing, and cleaning products. And the list goes on and on. So those two bills were part of the legislative agenda. And then I wanted to just also quickly highlight, and to correct myself, yes, part of the legislative agenda, but part of that top priority list. But in terms of a bill that was not part of the top priority list, but did make it onto the agenda, is the Team Community Act. And that's the act that would enable the Transportation and Climate Initiative. I'm not going to get into details because Sue will talk more about the Transportation and Climate Initiative in that particular bill. But this bill was introduced later in the session. So therefore did not make it onto this top priority list that you're seeing on the screen. However, our climate crisis campaign will be focusing its organizing and advocacy education on three things moving forward. That does include the Transportation and Climate Initiative, or the Team Community Act, also 100% renewable electricity by 2030. And last but not least, very important, the implementation of the Act on Climate, which Sue will also dive into more details on that. Next slide, please. So before I segue into the 2021 legislative priorities of the Audubon Society of Rhode Island, considering my new role at Audubon, I wanted to briefly talk about our mission as an independent Audubon and a nonprofit in the Ocean State. So our mission as Audubon is to protect birds, other wildlife, and their habitats through conservation, education, and advocacy. And that is for the benefit of people and all living things. So Audubon carefully follows the many threats to birds, and it's clear to us and based on the science that climate change is the biggest threat to birds, wildlife, and all living things. And also wanted to point out that in our current strategic plan and strategic direction for the organization, it's really driven by science and what the science is telling us about the climate crisis, that it's now, as we've heard from the IPCC report, intensifying and accelerating and really further threatening birds, especially migratory birds and other wildlife, and our environment hand in hand, and really increasing overall the vulnerability of our state and our economy, and also our communities. As we've pointed out, our frontline communities are especially vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So next, I'll segue into the list of priority bills that were adopted by Audubon in 2021. And I think will really set the framework for our continued priorities going into next session. So I'm not going to get into many details because Sue is going to do a deeper dive in a few minutes, but I wanted to just highlight several priorities that were adopted by Audubon and also supported by the environmental community that is on ECRI's legislative agenda. So the Oscar Fund, I'll highlight first. It was passed, although it was passed without a funding mechanism. It does establish a policy and program to protect and strengthen Rhode Island ecological water systems. And these are the water systems that we all depend on, like the Bay, and the public access sites that are threatened by rising seas and erosion. So our friends at Save the Bay are the lead advocates on this, and we'll be working with the committed sponsors of the bill to identify the necessary funding for this climate adaptation work. So just wanted to highlight that there's continued work there. And then the second one that I'll highlight is forest conservation, the Forest Conservation Act. So this bill successfully was passed by the entire General Assembly as well, and it establishes a commission that will look at ways to encourage forest conservation as a means to sequester carbon and mitigate climate change and maintain the numerous other benefits provided by forests. And other two issues that I'll highlight on this list is that Audubon continues to work on issues related to pollinator health and habitat. And research is showing a link between pesticide use, particularly neonics, which Sue will talk about, and the impacts of these pesticides have on birds. And let's see here. The last thing I'll highlight from this list, in the interest of time, is solar siting. So Audubon continues to work with the Nature Conservancy, Green Energy Consumers, and other advocates on advocating for solar siting. So from Audubon's perspective, to limit the worst impacts of climate change, we know we need to move forward with the development of offshore wind and also onshore solar projects. However, it's really of equal importance that we achieve this balance between protecting our environment and our natural resources and also responding to climate change and transitioning to this clean energy economy. So what do we do together collectively to advocate for policies that are going to maximize building on already disturbed land and maximizing solar development on rooftops and parking lots? And that's all part of this balanced approach that will continue to work together leading up to this next legislative session. So I think I'm right on time to hand it over to Sue.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Priscilla. And a big thank you to both Priscilla and Shauna and Debbie from NEWIEE for putting on this forum. And I'm just so excited to be with Priscilla and Shauna, who are two of my very favorite women who get things done in Rhode Island, who I look up to so much. So this is just a real treat for me. So again, I'm Sue AnderBois. I am the Climate Energy Program Manager with the Nature Conservancy. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Nature Conservancy, I just wanted to share our mission. So the mission of the Nature Conservancy is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. We're a global nonprofit. We have offices in nearly 80 countries and in all 50 states. I live and I work here in Rhode Island, and in Rhode Island we steward, we own close to 11,000 acres of land, and then we help steward in partnership with partners like the Audubon Society in the state of Rhode Island an additional 35,000 acres of land, and that's a lot of that land is for public use. And I will continue on from there. Oops, gotta change my own slides here. One sec. There we go. There we go. Great. As Priscilla mentioned at the beginning, this legislative session was a year kind of like it we haven't had in a while. So I did a very simple graphic here with some green arrows and yellow triangles, but really showing things got passed this year, and it was a pretty exciting time. And a lot of that was because of the really great organizing that Priscilla and her team at ECRI, including Kai and Mal and others, did to really focus our advocacy on just a few key priorities, including the solid focus just on the Act on Climate to start over the last 2 years. So a real testament to them, and also to our champions in both the Senate and the House. For example, Lauren Carson in the House, and Senator Dawn Oyer in the Senate, who were our sponsors for Act on Climate. But just a quick summary. So these were some of the Nature Conservancy's top priorities. This is not an exhaustive list of the things that we supported, but kind of a big summary of some of the things that were big priorities for us. And you'll notice that they align really well with ECRI's priorities as well as with the Audubon's priorities. And that's a real testament again to like the really great organizing that went into getting us kind of all working together and all on the same page. There's always so many environmental priorities, and we know that we need to really focus in order to get things through. So Priscilla already talked about the success we had in passing the Act on Climate legislation. I'll also add early in the session, we had success with passing the green bond as part of a series of bond measures that were passed in a special election last March. And a number of the advocates worked together to do some polling and some outreach, particularly to that bond, which would provide tens of millions of dollars for funding for things like conservation, parks, municipal resilience, and other really important initiatives. So that was a really big deal, and the first time in like anyone's memory that there had been a special election in March for a bond measure. And so it was really excited to see the level of participation and support that the green bond had. Priscilla already mentioned energy efficiency, and then there are a few things that are in process that we saw real progress on, but did not quite yet make it over the finish line, which gives us hope that they will soon. So those were things like addressing solar siting, which includes both forest policy and targeted clean energy deployment, which I'll dig into a little bit more. The regulation of neonicotinoid pesticides. I wasn't going to put that whole word there because then no one would read it, but we just call them neonics to protect pollinators and also birds. The 100% renewable electricity standard, and the Team Community Act. So all are in some form of process of passage, which is great. And we just need to finish getting them over the finish line. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about implementing Act on Climate. So it was a really big win to get this passed. The state now has binding science-based targets that would get us to net zero energy by 2050. And now we have to do it. Now we have to get there. So the very first thing that's required in the Act on Climate legislation is that we develop, and by we I mean the state of Rhode Island develops a plan for how we're going to get there. And that first initial plan is due next December, so December 2022. In state, for folks who haven't been involved in state planning before, that's basically tomorrow. It's kind of even yesterday. So the timing to get that done is really important. And so a concern that the advocacy community has, including the Nature Conservancy, is there's really no time to wait. Act on Climate was signed in the spring, which was so exciting. One of the very first bills signed by our new governor, Governor McKee. We haven't seen a lot of action yet. We haven't seen that planning process started. So we really, after the planning process, we need to see aggressive reductions immediately before 2030 to meet those goals. And so we're going to need to make some real progress real fast. And so the advocates sent a letter, or many of the advocates worked together to send a letter to Governor McKee on July 7th, which we'll note is about 2 months ago. And some of the key provisions from that memo have been the need to, well, one, get started. So that's that's point zero. But then others have been, the really need to prioritize justice and equity, and also a really robust stakeholder process in developing this plan and in implementing Act on Climate. This isn't something that someone can develop a plan sitting alone in their office and say, great, this is how we're going to get there. It really needs to be developed in partnership with community across the state. The second is really hiring and empowering necessary state staff to enable success. To really get this done, we're going to need to actually put some resources behind it and empower some of the really great state staff that we have, like Shauna, to take on work like this and really empower them to lead this effort. It's not something you can just do by hiring some consultants to write a report. We need to have people in place who can implement and can move forward. So really providing it the resources that it needs in terms of state staff. The third is to establish clear timelines for how we're going to get to that plan, like how we're going to get to a plan that's robust and ready by December 2022. And last but not least, not waiting to implement several critical actions, which we can talk more about. And some of those are policies, some of those are programs, but there are a lot of things. The state has done a series of studies over the course of the last several years, and we know some of the big action steps that we can take right now. So there's no need to wait to do those as we develop the plan for how to go forward. So that's implementing Act on Climate. I think a lot of times we pass bills and it's great to feel like, whew, that was a big lift, you guys, like, let's celebrate. But the real heart of it is then getting it done. So we're excited to turn our attention over to the implementation of Act on Climate. The second thing that I really want to dig in a little bit more is on solar siting and how we both really aggressively expand our investment in clean energy resources across Rhode Island and also across this region, while also protecting open space and forests for the critical roles that they play. So Priscilla talked a bit about the role of forests, like and why forests are so important. But some of the things that we all know forests do. So forests are sources of carbon sequestration, but they also filter our water. They keep the air cooler. They're important wildlife habitat and also wildlife corridors. So they're doing really important things. And also at the same time, about 50% of our state's forest land is privately owned. And so those are decisions that are being made by private owners across the state. And that's not unique. That's a lot of forest land across the region is privately owned by individuals. So we have this dichotomy of we both need to aggressively expand clean energy to address the climate crisis, and also we need to aggressively preserve our open space to address the climate crisis. And we actually think this is a yes and if we do this carefully and with some great planning. Current programs really drive a lot of clean energy development to like the least cost or least price places to develop, which happens to often be open space because we don't value the forest land. And so a lot of the advocates are trying to figure out and work with industry and other stakeholders to figure out what would we need to do to really design incentives for development to push it to places that would be more, quote unquote, preferred, places like rooftops and former industrial sites. I like to be a golden retriever and be very optimistic and say that Rhode Island is blessed with a lot of these types of sites. We have a lot of former industrial sites. We have a lot of brownfields. We have a lot of rock quarries. We have a lot of places that are really primed for this kind of development. And so the example I have on the screen here, this could be its own presentation. So I'm happy to dig in on this with any NEWIEE members ever and just really come up with some creative solutions together. Priscilla's been a really important thought partner. The example here, this is a solar site in East Providence. That is built on a former landfill that has been capped. And so you can see this great solar, I'm pointing like you can see me, but you can see this great, oh, you can probably see this though, this great solar facility. No trees had to be torn down because this was already a former landfill that had just been capped. And so sites like this are the types of sites that we're talking about. Just a few other pictures to illustrate. So the state did, OER, the Office of Energy Resources, did a study with Synapse that they released in 2020, looking at the potential for solar siting in some of these preferred areas. So places like gravel pits and industrial sites and rooftops and all sorts of things. This is just one picture from that report, but overall, even if the report wasn't like perfect, which I know no report is ever perfect, it did show vast potential in a lot of these sites that is currently untapped. And so this is just an example of residential economic potential by municipality. And you can see, especially in the urban core, that there's a lot of untapped residential rooftop. And this is not even taking into account a lot of the commercial rooftop and other rooftops. So there's a lot of concentration. What you're seeing on the left is a photo. It's a little hard to parse, I apologize, but this is a picture of a map that looks at, it's from the Nature Conservancy's Connected and Resilience Land Mapping tool. You can see kind of like to the left, this is showing some of the most important wildlife habitat. And I'm showing this map in particular because you can really see, I feel like a lot of times we look at Rhode Island specific maps, and this takes us out a little bit and shows the importance of some of these corridors into other parts, into other states. So as we like chunk these up and start developing on them, we lose some of those really important connections here in what the Nature Conservancy refers to as the borderlands. And so there's a lot of different maps like this. This is the critical habitat map. We have a lot of other maps, but if you kind of zoom out, you can see that the the western part of Rhode Island is actually an incredibly important both wildlife habitat corridor, and also like connection of green space to other larger areas. It's easy to get our little Rhode Island blinders on of like, oh, it's just Western Rhode Island, but it's really a really big piece of this larger conservation question. And it's interesting to see like where that isn't is like, for example, right here in the urban core, where we often see in those maps from the Synapse study, where there's the biggest potential for rooftop, industrial, and other types of preferred sites. So just putting that out there as topics we're discussing. Other policies that are in progress, again, that didn't quite make it over the finish line, but we're hopeful they will soon. One, again, is the Neonic pesticides. So this would regulate neonicotinoid pesticides, which are a significant issue for pollinator species like bees, like honeybees. This would be the first time that we would have regulated pesticides in this state in a really long time. There are very few regulations on pesticides. And what it would basically do is say that you would have to be a licensed professional to use these in certain applications. And so if you're using it outside in a sprayed application where it could potentially harm a pollinator like a bee, you need to be a licensed, a registered user. It has exemptions for things like farmers who use coated seeds to plant things like potatoes, because that wasn't necessarily something that was going to affect pollinators. There are a number of different carve outs, really trying to tailor this specifically to pollinator protection. It passed the House. We're really grateful to my Representative Kislak, who was our sponsor. And we're hopeful that we can come back and get it through in the Senate. The second one on here, which Priscilla also talked about, was the 100% renewable energy standard, which again did pass the Senate and was sponsored by the Senate president, which was so exciting. He came out after and talked to a group of us advocates who were outside of where the Senate was taking their votes. I think they were at Rick. And was just so excited. You know, he's like, we just passed 100%. We're going to pass energy efficiency legislation today too. And we didn't quite get it over the finish line in the House, but I'm optimistic that we'll be able to do that in 2022. And then last but not least, the Team Community Act, which as Priscilla mentioned, is the piece of legislation that would help us implement the Transportation and Climate Initiative. Transportation and Climate Initiative is a regional initiative across many states in the Northeast that would help cap and invest emissions from the transportation sector. In Rhode Island, the main thing it would do is to provide actual funding for projects for transportation, clean transportation, transit, bike and walkability, green and complete streets, all the really great things that we always want to do in Rhode Island and do not have the funding for. It would provide an additional source of funding for those types of initiatives. So it did indeed pass the Senate, which was really exciting. Sponsor Senator DeMaria was our big champion. And it didn't quite pass in the House yet, but we're hopeful for next year. And that's sponsored by Representative Terry Cordfriend. But it'd be an exciting way. And a big champion of this also has been Director Terry Gray, the new acting director over at the Department of Environmental Management. So he's been involved in these conversations. And Rhode Island was one of the first states to sign on to TCI, along with our friends in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and I believe Washington, DC. So I'm running quickly out of time. So I'll just say we're really excited about 2022. There's a number of things in process that didn't quite make it over the finish line, that will make it over the finish line, and a number of key policies that are going to be necessary to pass if we're going to get on track to meet the Act on Climate goals. So I'm really excited about that. And I'll turn it back to Shauna for questions and conversations. Let me stop sharing.
Great. Thanks, Sue. Thanks, Priscilla. I'm really hoping you guys have some great questions for both of them. If you do, feel free to put them in the chat, but since we can fit everybody on one screen here, we don't have that many folks, feel free to come off mute as well. If you just want to come off mute and ask a question, we can do it that way, but I've got a question to get us started here. So you guys both talked about all of the work that has to, the upcoming work for implementing Act on Climate. Are there any legislative items on that list for 2022? And what can folks that are in this room right now, this virtual room, do to help move that along?
Happy to get that answer going. Yes, look at the Environment Council of Rhode Island's top priority list. That was really like our framework, and I'm glad you asked that question because like once we passed the Act on Climate, we were like, but there's more work to be done. Like this set the framework and the tone. So like, let's not forget about 100% renewable electricity by 2030. Let's not forget about the Transportation and Climate Initiative. We also have to make sure that we're continuously responding to the challenge of adapting to a changing climate and investing in adaptation and resiliency. So really looking for like, what are the things that we can do now? But on the legislative side, I see those two pieces of legislation as critical bills, being the extending the renewable energy standard to 100% and really making sure that Rhode Island is addressing emissions from the transportation sector and that we're also bringing in revenue that's needed to invest in clean energy, electrifying public transit, and also making sure, as Sue mentioned, that our neighborhoods are walkable and bike friendly. So those are two immediate things, and we're hoping that we'll continue to echo and build momentum around that going into the next legislative session. And the second part to that question, I think it's a great one, which is why the Environment Council of Rhode Island formed the Climate Crisis Campaign. So folks can really tap into a network of organizations and individuals that are looking for creative ways to mobilize around climate and environmental issues. But I'll just say that we don't have to wait till the next legislative session to continue the conversation around climate. So anything we can do, either in having the conversation with family and friends and just making sure that these issues remain front and center on our social media channels, the sharing of information, but also contacting our elected officials and really making sure that we let them know that we're still thinking about climate and implementing the Act on Climate. Sorry, I meant to be short in that answer, but I rambled on.
Yeah, I'll just agree with Priscilla and add that I think in Rhode Island, we're incredibly lucky that we have such great access to our elected officials. Like Rebecca Kislak and I, Representative Kislak, would sometimes talk about neonics because I would just bump into her while walking my dog. You know, like we are blessed with being so close physically to our elected officials, and a lot of them have their personal home numbers on the General Assembly website. And so just talking with your friends and family and keeping this front of mind for people is really important, so that when we come back in 2022, January 2022, if there isn't a special session this fall, we're ready to move on some things. And to the women on this, women and men, I see there's some men here too, for the people on this call who are energy professionals, like, you know, we talked about solar siting, for example, and the need to both expand rapidly clean energy across the state and the region, as well as protect our critical forest land. Like, this is hard. You guys are really smart. Would love to have as many of your amazing brains at the tables as possible as we are developing advocacy positions and trying to move this through. The solutions aren't going to be easy, and there's some really, really smart people on this call in the audience that I would love to work with on these questions.
Great. All right. So I'm going to switch to the green bond question legislation that passed. I know I didn't give you guys a heads up about this question in advance, but it just kind of came to mind while you were talking. What happens, green bonds pass and then they kind of just, we don't really hear about them anymore. So I know that the green bond will help with resiliency projects. And Sue, I know you're involved in the municipal resiliency program with RIB. Can you just talk a little bit about what the passage of the green bond means for your work on resiliency?
Oh yeah, I would love to. So one thing I was really excited about in the green bond, there was $7 million set aside for projects for the municipal resilience program. I also want to give a quick shout out to Sam Lash, who I see in the audience, who's our municipal resilience program coordinator through October. She's been amazing. So just want to give her a quick shout out. I see her there. But the Municipal Resilience Program is a partnership between RIB, the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank, and the Nature Conservancy. And we work with each municipality to and hold a workshop and do planning with them around climate resilience, and really help them identify what some of their big strengths are, where some of their vulnerabilities are. And then the end product is really helping them develop a list of projects, some of which are infrastructure and some of which are other types of projects that would increase their climate resilience. And the big problem is that a lot of times money is the issue. And so the great thing about the MRP is or the Municipal Resilience Program MRP, is that municipalities can go through this workshop, and then RIB can work with them to fund at least an initial project, hopefully more than one project. But $7 million only goes so far, but it goes so far. That's a good initial project to get the ball rolling. And now, as we see infrastructure funding coming for the federal government, or even like funding coming from FEMA for climate resilience, like that gets them ready to apply for more funding for more projects. So it's really kind of a mechanism to create kind of that list. I mean, not to be so blunt about it, but a list of projects they're just ready to implement and get going. It's meant to not be one of those plans that sits on a shelf. And so the green bond was amazing, because without that $7 million, one, there isn't the same carrot to participate in the planning process, and two, you can't really get the ball rolling with initial project. It's like you would otherwise finish the workshop and be like, great, what do I do now? Now it's RIB can show up and be like, cool, let's get your first project underway and get going. So I was really excited about that initial $7 million.
Well, I have more questions, but I'm really hoping that somebody else will pipe up and ask one. So I'll pause here. Does anybody? I'll keep talking. So Priscilla, you were talking about the Climate Jobs Rhode Island Coalition, and I think that's a really exciting initiative, and the fact that labor and environment are getting together to come up with some really creative solutions. So and you covered this a little bit, but what are some of the next steps for Climate Jobs Rhode Island in moving forward all of the work that needs to be done for Act on Climate?
Thank you for that question. I think it's a really exciting initiative and effort that's really going to have an impact on the types of solutions that we come up with jointly to really address the climate crisis, but also make sure that we're not leaving anyone behind as we are transitioning our economy of fossil fuels. So we started the year really with establishing like a solid framework of like what are going to be the guiding principles and goals of this coalition. And we have those up on our website, on the Climate Jobs Rhode Island website. We're really coming to an agreement on like what are the types of things that we're going to prioritize when it comes to creating jobs in transportation, in building efficiency, and really getting us at the root of some of these socioeconomic issues and race issues that really are embedded across our different economies. So how do we really work together creatively in applying that climate jobs lens and also that equity lens when we're working on these solutions and thinking about things like workforce development and thinking about cleaning up the transportation sector. So I think that foundation is really strong for us. And I'm really proud that we quickly came together to establish those and also reach an understanding that we're not going to agree on everything, but really the goal is how do we maximize the things that we do agree on? What are those opportunities? And part of that work is a lot of learning and sharing in terms of, learning things within the labor movement and really what are the labor standards that should be in bills like the Renewable Energy Standard Bill or energy efficiency bills. And also learning about the importance of some of the environmental bills that we've been collectively working to pass. So going into 2022, what we're hoping to do is build more capacity to our team. So thanks to funding, we're actually onboarding 2 new hires to the coalition that are going to work full-time in organizing and really making sure that Climate Jobs Rhode Island is listening to the community, in frontline communities, and working with frontline workers and hearing what are their ideas, their solutions, and really expanding the coalition to be more diverse and reflective of the community. So I'm excited about that work. And the other work is really tapping into the policy we as advocates, like we work together, we roll up our sleeves, we know what we have to do to advocate at the State House, but it's usually like, what's the meat and tofu behind all of that we're advocating for? Sue loves that. I always say the tofu and think of Sue. So what is the meat and tofu behind everything that we're doing, and what are the opportunities? How are we connecting them? How are we really tapping into whatever federal funding is out there? What are the gaps in the things that we're working on? So I'm hoping we can go into the next session with a very sort of solid understanding of what our joint policy priorities are, but also coming to the table and saying, like, this is the cost of inaction, and these are the opportunities, and this is where the funding is going to come from. And that was another long-winded response, but I guess that just shows how excited I am about all this work, and also the work with Climate Jobs Rhode Island.
Absolutely. No, that's great. So we do have an audience question. Actually, we have two now. So from Chrissy. Has there been any meaningful discussion or overlap between the objectives and the Act on Climate and the International Sustainable Development Goals? I'm wondering to what extent the global agenda and the Rhode Island agenda are syncing up.
That's a good question. I can start, and then Priscilla, please jump in and correct. I'd say in Rhode Island, we haven't explicitly said we are referencing the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And also at the same time but also I think that there's a lot of alignment in that, like the Act on Climate legislation, for example, one moves us toward science-based, like actual targets for what we would need to do, our actual goals. And also for the first time acknowledges some of the other more systematic issues that relate to climate change. So it references racial equity and just transition. It references good jobs and like jobs that could, alleviate poverty. So other elements of the Sustainable Development Goals are in there, even if it's not explicitly referenced. And I can say, working at the Nature Conservancy as a global organization, a lot of our goals align with our TNC has like overall, we call it the we're like one conservancy, so we have a shared conservation agenda, and tackling climate change is part of that, and the other part is preserving the land and water on which all life depends, which is like, kind of two big tranches here, but and really tie ourselves to kind of that global science-based perspective. So a lot of what we end up doing in Rhode Island ties to that larger kind of global perspective as the Nature Conservancy. But Priscilla, what would you add beyond the fact that we kind of looked at this from a more systems approach?
I think that fully covers it. I think the only thing I'll add from the Audubon perspective, which is a sort of TBD in terms of we're adding also more capacity on our sort of science approach to what's driving our advocacy. So I wouldn't rule out us taking a closer look or sort of connecting the dots more at what's going globally. And when I mean we're adding more capacity, we're hiring a bird expert, really bringing in that bird scientific lens to all the advocacy that we're doing. So that will be an ornithologist that's going to start mid-September. We actually developed a bird atlas for Rhode Island, and his name is Charles Clarkson. So that's the only thing I'll add. And I think that's not so basically my answer is no, intentionally, as Sue said, we have not looked at those international sustainable development goals or linked them explicitly. But yes, with the Act on Climate implementation, I think that there is like a lot of sort of alignment overall, whether it's intentional or not, because we know we need to curb and reduce our emissions dramatically. I think it's a matter of how we're going to get there and what those solutions are and what our approach is going to be in the state. But I don't know if that was a helpful response or if I totally responded to that incorrectly.
And Priscilla, I'd also add for Chrissy, if this is something you'd love to work on, I think we would love to work on this with you, because looking at the goals, like just reminding myself what they are on the side of my screen here, like entirely in line with what we've been talking about. And I just lost that screen, but things like ending poverty, having affordable energy, sustainable communities, reduced inequalities, like all of these are clean water and good sanitation, gender equality. I think these are all linked in with the things that we've been discussing. So if you see an explicit way we should be making those connections, would love, I'm gonna just pop my email in the chat just in case you want to connect sometime.
Yeah, that's a great, thank you, Sue, for that. And also, I guess thinking about the Climate Jobs Rhode Island initiative and also the climate crisis campaign, that was definitely the goal of like, how do we go beyond looking at things through the sole environmental and climate lens, but really acknowledge things like there's no climate justice without racial justice. And how do you really center those issues and see the linkage between issues in housing and transportation, race, and so on. And like Sue mentioned, our sort of implementation coalition for the Act on Climate continues to grow. So I think different perspectives and working on those solutions and really advocating to the state for the implementation of the Act on Climate. I think part of the role we've also taken on is like, well, here are some recommendations. These are things that you should strongly consider to get going. And I will say also lastly, from that Audubon perspective, just a better tie in my comment about bringing in more scientific approach. I think one of the things that Audubon is aiming to do in its recent strategic plan is really addressing just that it goes beyond the science. The science is very important. Climate change is the biggest threat to humans, wildlife, all living things, birds. But really in terms of environmental justice and frontline communities and the issues that are impacting those communities and how they're all connected. And how it's really imperative that when we're looking at these solutions, we're looking at it through these very comprehensive lens. So I think all hands on deck to really figure out those things. So thank you, Chrissy, for that. I'll be looking closer at those development goals you referenced.
Well, that actually segues very nicely into the last question we have from Sam. So you guys both have work for organizations that have strategic goals. So what do you see as the biggest gaps not currently addressed in active legislation or even just beyond 2022? So like, what's next after all of the work that we have to do in the next 24 months?
Oh my gosh, Sam, that's such a big question. So many things. I'll just get started with saying I'm excited about some of the big things that we have on tap for 2022, like the 100% RES, expanding TCI through the Teen Community Act. Like those are pretty big things that I hope we get over the finish line in 2022. I also think some elements of solar siting we can get in on in 2022, but will be a larger, longer question. I'd also love to see things like, I know we have some friends from the PUC and DPUC on. I'd love to see more like work on grid modernization and how we really ready the grid for the quantity of clean energy that we will be connecting, and how we do that in the most cost-effective way, knowing that we will have to make those investments and that the option for doing nothing is the least cost-effective of those options. And so digging in on how we do that, I think will be a really big open question, and a lot of thinking has already been done on that, but we need to start implementing some of that and do more thinking. I mean, these are going to be really sticky issues. And also like minor thing that I'm excited about that like I feel like I haven't talked about a lot is like, how do we really stop investing in more gas infrastructure in Rhode Island, and also move folks immediately who want to transition from oil to electricity and kind of skip the transition to natural gas for some of those homes. And I think that there's a question around how we do decoupling for gas versus how we do decoupling for electricity in Rhode Island. And I'm not sure that we've really dug into that. And that could be a 2022 thing, but like how we do that transition and just kind of skip over that, because we know that's no longer a transition fuel, but a fuel of the past. So sorry, I use it all the time, Priscilla, but please jump in. We can totally go over, I think.
I agree with everything you mentioned. I was just kept nodding away. And I'll just echo, yes, I think in terms of modernizing our grid and making sure that the New England grid is prepared to continue this transition off a fossil fuel-based economy and adding renewable energy. And there's a lot that happens on the regulatory space. I know that my friends at Green Energy Consumers Alliance and other nonprofits are following that closely in terms of the decisions that are being made at the Public Utilities Commission and also the division. And I think those are very important conversations happening there. And I think more focus on how some of those decisions could also be guided through a climate and equity lens are very important. Yeah, and I think also when thinking about workforce development and just the opportunities with offshore wind, there's all different kinds of jobs that are going to be created as a result of that growing industry. And I think also equity is a part of that and how to ensure that environmental justice communities not only are better off because there's less pollution in their backyards as we transition away from fossil fuels, and facilities that have a high carbon footprint, but also that they're seeing the benefits of that transition and also accessing those jobs that are coming from that clean energy based economy.
Wow, that's a daunting list, but I'm looking forward to working with you both on tackling some of those. Thank you both so much for being with us. I think we could keep talking forever. I know I've talked to both of you about a lot of these things over drinks, many, we could keep talking as we always do. So just thanks again to you both. There's a poll that Debbie just put up, and if everybody could respond to the 4 super quick questions here, just about the events, so we can continue doing these types of events based on feedback that you guys provide to us. So I think we're 2 minutes over. I want to give respect everybody's time. So thanks so much for being with us today, and look forward to the next Rhode Island chapter event. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.